You know, just before I start, I recently had the opportunity to go on the Dr. Phil show. I'll mention that in my talk. And I had this whole talk, set up when Dr. Phil asked me a question, but Ben Carson went first. And I was sitting there listening to him. You sit in the audience before it starts, and I said, oh my God, he's saying everything I wanted to say. I just had that feeling again. And Dr. Hughes said it so beautifully, we probably could skip my talk. But, we teach medical students that repetition is important, so let's try that. We'll have a little bit of a different slant, and I'll focus a little bit on what we've done. So let's start. So a resolution was offered at the Indiana State Medical Association just last week to eliminate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion activities in the state's institutions of higher education. A student who asked to remain anonymous wrote the following as a comment in support of this resolution. I quote, "As a professional student, I understand the motivations and intent behind DEI. However, its implementation and real-world use have led to the weaponization of these initiatives, stifling medical education, and creating a fearful environment where learning and vulnerability are hindered by the constant needs to tread carefully." This is from a student. Another student commented how these discussions had disturbed his educational experience. I quote again, "While teaching us about bias, there was blatant bias shown by the discussion leaders towards other races and beliefs. Anyone who questioned their thoughts was immediately shut down. In stark contrast, we only had a 1-hour session to learn how to suture, an important clinical skill to be proficient in." The student has insight. "As a result, many in our class felt we did not receive adequate education in this topic. The discussion panel was only one of the several hours and days we spent on listening to our group's beliefs without any real discussion or room for debate." You know, that these statements can be made in the United States in the 21st century should concern all of us. Do No Harm, the nonprofit we started in April 2022, began with a simple mission. First, and most relevant to our discussion tonight, it aimed at eliminating discrimination in medicine. Now, we've also had a second mission to combat so-called gender-affirming care in children. I'm not going to speak at all about that, but any of you would like to ask questions about it later or talk with me, I'd be delighted to speak with you about it. So, first and most relevant to our discussion tonight, it aimed at eliminating discrimination in medicine. At one point in time, many decades ago, such a mission would have meant ensuring that minority patients actually got health care. Today, however, it means something very different. It means restoring meritocracy to the selection of students and faculty of medical schools. It means not creating separate pathways for patients based on skin color. It means protecting physicians from slanderous accusations of racism and bias against minority patients, and it represents eliminating all aspects of identity politics from the healthcare system. First, let's consider why the diversity, equity, and inclusion regimen, the implementation arm of identity politics, is so dangerous for medicine. Let's take each component in turn. Diversity. So diversity is championed for two reasons. First, it is based on a desire to repair a historic inequality wherein minority groups, particularly African Americans, were denied an opportunity to become physicians. Flexner, in his famous report of 1915, closed down 5 of the 7 medical schools associated with historic black colleges and universities because they were providing an inferior education. He has been vilified for this, but it was the right thing to do. The schools were providing an unacceptably inferior education for their students. It did reduce the opportunity for deserving black individuals, however. But in this day and age, where no qualified minority applicant is denied admission to medical school, the diversity movement seeks to increase admissions of minorities to reflect their proportion of the American population. This is a quota system. This is illegal in the United States, as it violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. One might try to create some legal justification for this if it did not require a compromise in the academic achievements of applicants, but it does. In this way, it is part of the reparations movement in American life. And Heather McDonald, who you heard about from the previous speaker, Dr. Hughes, has written about this extensively, and I recommend her writings. Mark Perry, a professor of economics at the University of Michigan and a senior fellow at Do No Harm, had published in 2016 data previously supplied by the AAMC that showed that black applicants with just average GPAs and MCAT scores were almost 4 times more likely to be admitted to U.S. medical schools than Asian applicants and 3 times more likely than white applicants. Whites with the same academic performances had a 30% acceptance rate. Blacks had an 81% acceptance rate. But lower performing black applicants with lower than average GPAs and MCAT scores had a 9 times greater likelihood of admission than comparable Asians and 7 times greater likelihood than white applicants. But here is the kicker. Merit was compromised. All white and Asian applicants with such substandard performance had a 16% chance of acceptance. Blacks with similar below average performance had an 86% rate of acceptance. The substandard academic achievements for these minority matriculants translates into lower performance as medical students, a finding of many, many studies, and as residents. Now, there are 2 large studies of minority resident performance. One of internal medicine residents at 5 leading academic medical centers published in Academic Medicine, and a second of a nationwide survey of emergency medicine residence program directors published in JAMA Network. In each study, minority trainees as a group performed less well in virtually every dimension of the assessment system, including medical knowledge, preparation for practice, or professionalism. And poor performance on objective assessments translates into lower quality clinical outcomes. Now, there were certainly outstanding minority students and residents within these groups, but this is the results of the group average. We know that this lower clinical outcome is real. We know this from a recent study published by the American Board of Internal Medicine. Trainees who score lowest on the certifying exam actually have the highest patient mortality and readmission rates. And finally, a recent study from Norway shows that when patients are randomly assigned to primary care physicians, as occurs in that country, thus eliminating patient variability as an often unmeasurable parameter, some patient panels do worse consistently than other panels of patients, suggesting that it does matter who your physician is. Taken together, these data clearly show that standards are being compromised in medical school admissions in pursuit of racial goals to compensate for historic inequities of opportunity. The attempt to provide reparations for historical inequities has its costs in the potential for lower quality of health care. To decide that admission to medical school should be based on past discriminatory practices ignores the true purpose of creating a healthcare workforce. The purpose of healthcare is to care for patients, not to provide meaningful careers for physicians. A meaningful career flows from the care of patients, not from the title, not from the prestige, which flows from the privilege of being a physician, and not from the economic benefits of being a physician. Thus, the responsibility to provide the most capable individuals to care for patients should be primary for admissions committees at medical schools. This is quite different from the situation in undergraduate school admissions. There, the purpose is to create an individual so that they may function optimally in a diverse society. The purpose of creating physicians is not so that physicians can prosper, but that society can prosper. Moreover, we do not need to infantilize medical students and claim that they, as adults, need to now learn to work with others and to live in a diverse society, even as they approach their mid-20s in age. So to me, the argument that something is owed to minorities who seek careers in medicine is a flawed and mistaken notion. If politicians wish to redress past discrimination with a variety of programs, that is fine, but medicine should be spared. The quality of care should be paramount in any discussion of the healthcare workforce. The second reason proposed as a benefit diversity is that Black patients actually have better health outcomes if they are cared for by Black physicians. The same logic has been applied to other minority groups. This claim has been made by many advocates for DEI, including the AAMC, the AMA, and virtually every associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion at every medical school in the United States. However, this claim is simply wrong. These advocates cherry-pick one or two papers that claim such a benefit and move on to racialize the admissions process at medical schools on this basis. But we know that this is not the way to examine the evidence. The way to examine the evidence is to gather all of it and assess its validity. Our organization has done this in an extensive review entitled The Resegregation of Medicine. There are 5 systematic reviews of this issue of racial concordance, encompassing over 60 individual studies, and their overwhelming conclusion is that there is no benefit to racial concordance, the shorthand title given to the idea of matching patients to physicians based on race. Let me just give you some detail from one of the systematic reviews. The study by Miller and colleagues from the University of Central Florida examined over 30 publications questioning whether communication between Black patients and Black physicians is superior to that between Black patients and white physicians. This idea that communication is the benefit of racial concordance is totally destroyed by this analysis. Examining all the instances in the 33 studies where various aspects of communication were assessed, in 12 cases, communication was better when Black patients had Black doctors. In 8 cases, it was actually worse between Black patients and Black doctors compared to Black patients and white doctors. In 86 other assessments of patient-physician communication, it made no difference. Examining the other 4 systematic reviews of this issue, including ones that attempted to get at some measure of health outcomes, again, there was no advantage to racial concordance. So the unrealized benefit of racial concordance does not justify sacrificing merit for diversity in determining who should be a physician. And make no mistake, eliminating MCAT requirements, basing admission on inflated undergraduate grades, and deciding that holistic admissions rather than rigorous assessment of academic potential is the way to determine who should have the opportunity to be a physician will inevitably lead to less effective health care. The second term of the DEI triad, equity, is, I admit, open to interpretation. It generally refers to the Ibram-Kendi definition, which demands equal outcomes, not merely equal opportunity. When one examines specific protocols for patient care or admission to medical school under DEI, equity, defined as required equal outcomes, not equal opportunity, is the rule. There are many examples of this, but let me just focus on one that an audience of physicians would appreciate. During the pandemic, a paper from Harvard Medical School appeared in the journal Heart Failure and pointed out that white heart failure patients seen in the emergency room at the Harvard hospitals were triaged to inpatient cardiology services more frequently than Black patients with heart failure. Black patients were more frequently referred to the general medical floor. The difference was small, but real. 45% of Black patients were referred to the cardiology services, while 57% of the white heart failure patients were, 45% of Black patients, yes, were referred to cardiology service, but 57% of the white heart failure patients were referred to cardiology services. The authors claim that they adjusted for underlying illnesses, but in fact they really had not. The 2 cohorts had very different clinical profiles. More Black patients had chronic kidney failure and were treated with dialysis. More white patients, compared to Black patients, had valvular heart disease as the basis for their heart failure. More Black patients were readmitted in 30 days compared to white patients, and this was seen as evidence of poor treatment of the Black patients. The authors decided that the difference between these two cohorts was biased. They never asked the emergency room physicians about the basis for their decisions for referral to the two different inpatient services. Those of us who care for such patients know that acute dialysis, the treatment for the dialysis patients with heart failure, is more easily accomplished in a general medical service, and that cardiac procedures may be required for the patients with valvular heart disease and are performed better on cardiology units. Moreover, patients receiving maintenance hemodialysis are frequently readmitted to the hospital because fluid overload and signs of congestive heart failure are a recurring problem because of fluid intake between regularly scheduled dialysis treatments. Higher readmission rates for these patients would not have been reduced by admission to a cardiology specialty service. Now here's the problem. In an attempt to create equity of outcome, Harvard hospitals proposed that Black patients would be queried regarding to which service they preferred to be admitted. The patients would decide what was best for them in this complex medical situation. And this was published, this proposal. They eventually relented in this proposal because even they saw how ridiculous this was. But to this day, there is a reminder in the electronic medical record there that there was an inequity in the way heart failure patients were admitted to the hospital. It asked physicians to make sure that they are not propagating this inequity by referring the Black patient to the appropriate site for further care. This sort of business is really quite dangerous for medicine, and there are many, many other examples of this foolishness. Lastly, what is the threat of inclusion? What a benign phrase. Don't we want to include everyone? However, like lots of the progressive lexicon, inclusion actually means the opposite of what it says. Some ideas apparently are worth inclusion, but not all. Anti-Semitism is apparently one of the favorite concepts of DEI administrators. My colleague, Jay Green, examined the social media activity of individuals working in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion around the country, and found that when addressing political issues, 80% of the time, they actually favored a position in which China came out ahead, whereas less than 20% of the time, they favored a position regarding Israel. And we have certainly come to see, after the really astounding congressional hearing of the Ivy League college presidents on anti-Semitism and other exclusionary activities in elite colleges, that just like the famous phrase in George Orwell's Animal Farm, all the pigs are equal, except some pigs are more equal than others. The widespread failure to condemn anti-Semitism in institutions with expansive diversity, equity, and inclusion programs just shows that this idea of inclusion is a joke. Inclusion in medical school admissions has also meant the inclusion only of individuals with a particular interest in political issues that masquerade under the name of social justice. Take the case of Matthew Winans. He is a veteran of the military and a disabled one at that. He applied to medical school with grades and MCAT scores equivalent to those of individuals accepted at medical school, and he did his own investigation of this. However, he was rejected because he did not demonstrate enough interest in community activities, volunteering, and other social activities. He was told by the admissions people that his volunteering for and serving in combat with the U.S. military did not count as the right kind of volunteering. This notion that only individuals with a particular social orientation are acceptable for medical school is a terrible example of how the idea of inclusion only includes those who basically embrace a political ideology. Our organization did a study of the secondary questions that are asked on medical school applications, and inevitably, they included some statement on what have you done to promote diversity in your community? What have you done to increase activities in the social justice arena? You need to answer positively on these questions in order to get into medical school now. Taken together then, diversity, equity, and inclusion actually mean the opposite of the definition in standard dictionaries. DEI is an illiberal concept that threatens American medicine because it is discriminatory, it is divisive, and it undermines the meritocratic ideal which our profession has always upheld. DEI is now deeply embedded in academic institutions and particularly in medical schools and large healthcare systems. I personally wasn't aware of how extensive this corruption was until the last few years of my time as Associate Dean of Curriculum at the Perelman School of Medicine at Penn. At that time, I thought we had a pretty successful medical school and were, I believe, engaged in some innovative approaches to medical education, teaching students to work in teams and interacting closely with them to understand in real time, each week, the success and failure of any aspects of their curriculum. Like most schools, we had a course that we called doctoring that involves teaching some aspects of the social aspects of medicine, including professionalism. However, a new vice dean for education was appointed and informed me that our curriculum was way out of date. We needed to train our students to become advocates for social causes, and we needed to cut back on the science in the curriculum to make room for issues that, in my mind, were the province of social workers. The advocates for emphasizing the social determinants of health in the medical school curriculum believe that it will allow physicians to address the main cause of chronic illness in the United States. The theory goes that poor neighborhoods, gun violence in the community, low voting propensity, and poverty in general produce illness. I don't know, maybe they have something there. But I suspect it all has to do with behaviors that promote poor health outcomes, such as not seeking medical care early in the manifestations of illness or not adhering to medical regimens. Whether or not this is the case, it's a bit hard to see what practicing physicians can do about any of these problems. I could not understand how I, as a doctor, could produce better supermarket choices in the community, reduce street violence, make kids attend school, and remedy other social issues. When I'm not a politician, I have no control over local city or state budgets. This realization led me down the path of activism. That was in 2018, and it was clear that my time at Penn was coming to an end. I was gently moved out of my role, and then the pandemic hit. 2020 was the year when the radically progressive elements in medical school faculties and even in the student body saw their opportunity to pounce. The death of George Floyd, as you heard from Dr. Hughes, was the signal, and pounce they did. White coats for Black lives demanded that everyone take a knee to American healthcare's past discriminatory practices, and in their words, current medical racism. By this time, I was already deep in the process of being canceled. I committed various offenses. For example, I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal entitled, "Take 2 aspirins and call me by my pronouns." That article actually simply argued against excessive focus on social issues in the medical curriculum and a turn to more rigorous criteria for matriculation. The Wall Street Journal supplied that title. I was not clever enough to do it. As a matter of fact, I complained as soon as I saw it. I was sort of appalled because the article had nothing to do with gender issues. And I wrote a scathing email to the Wall Street Journal. And eventually, it turned out I almost got the guy fired who wrote the title, but I think it really was a pretty good title. A bit later, I commented publicly on the studies, which I mentioned before, which showed that minority trainees in residency programs were performing less well than their peers. By my not agreeing that such assessments by faculty could only be because of racism on the faculty's part, I was labeled a racist. An email went out from my chairman of the Department of Medicine to the whole faculty that they rejected my racist comments. I simply said that when you perform poorly, maybe that was real, that you actually performed poorly. After that, my name was removed from the Penn website, even though I had been a faculty member for about 45 years at that point. Also, I had been co-director of the renal division at Penn, but there was a history of the renal division on its website, and my name was removed from that history, which was a clever bit of editing. The time had come for me to do something. I decided to model an organization after others that had become successful in K-12 education, devoted to combating the divisive and disruptive introduction of identity politics into childhood education. Many of these groups had used legal and legislative approaches to make change and had mobilized grassroots support amongst parents for their efforts. As I mentioned before, we launched Do No Harm in April 2022. Through the support of some concerned philanthropic individuals, we were able to quickly staff up and begin our efforts. We recruited an incredibly effective woman named Christina Rasmussen to be our executive director, and her background helped drive the path we would take. She had spent her career in implementing policies for what she calls the Freedom Agenda at the state level. It did not preclude federal efforts, but the states were where healthcare policy and educational policy are really enacted, and they became our target. We launched a three-pronged approach. First, we aimed to engage the public. We formed a membership organization, Do No Harm, which now numbers some 11,000 physicians, nurses, and other concerned individuals. We wrote a series of ads and commentaries that garnered public attention. Many of the topics came from tips provided to us by our members regarding discriminatory practices that they saw in their medical practices as well as in their institutions. After 2.5 years, we have received over 1,000 tips about such activities. These efforts have resulted in over 10,000 media hits, including publications, as well as appearances on various TV shows, such as Fox's Evening News, and as I mentioned, most recently, the Dr. Phil Show. The latter was really a most interesting experience, where I had the opportunity of debating a vice president of the NAACP, also a physician, a very bright woman, and a former DEI dean from Emory Medical School, along with the neurosurgeon, Dr. Ben Carson. I think these efforts have been successful in that there was a recent panel at Harvard Medical School that declared that I and Do No Harm were the biggest problem that DEI had in medical education. I see this as making good trouble. A nice example of our good trouble, and I think you'll like this, is the Do No Harm CME course, currently offered to physicians and other healthcare workers in Michigan. The governor of Michigan decreed that all healthcare workers must take a 2-hour course in implicit bias training to have licensure renewal. And these courses typically require that individuals take the implicit association test, a highly flawed psychological exercise that has now been shown to be completely invalid and unreproducible in determining whether anyone is actually biased. Nonetheless, it is widely used. These courses also explain to the practitioners how biased they are, how racist they are, and the need to purge these thoughts to produce better healthcare outcomes. None of this has an empirical basis. All of it is pure political propaganda. Do No Harm decided that we could provide an alternative course, and we have produced an evidence-based course, and we now have had over 2,000 individuals in Michigan take this course. We decided to charge a minimal fee and free the individuals taking our course from being pummeled over their so-called bias. So far, the state of Michigan has accepted our course to fulfill the licensure requirement. We're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Along with information, however, there must be action. And here we begin to see a role for government, as well as a role for pressuring professional medical societies. Also, there is a role for legal action. Again, this approach employs tactics that have been used by progressive organizations to try to promote their agenda. What's good for the goose is also good for the gander. Our first legal effort was against a small player in healthcare, the Department of Health and Human Services. In 2021, a final rule was published for Medicare, which included a rule that incentivized physicians to insert anti-racism protocols in their medical practice. If they adopted such protocols, they would earn an increased payment under the Quality Improvement Program. Now, this sounds rather benign, but in fact, it was a clarion call to install discriminatory practices in the provision of health care. And you'll recall that the Biden administration said that diversity, equity, inclusion would be throughout their whole administration and all of their policies. Now, we had seen early examples of this during the COVID pandemic, where several states created algorithms for the use of scarce monoclonal antibodies. The algorithms gave points for skin color as much as they gave points for degree of illness. and therefore were deemed anti-racist. But actually, they were profoundly racist. A Do No Harm member objected to this incentive to insert anti-racism protocols in his practice and was unwilling to discriminate in the way he treated his patients. He became the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit that we filed against HHS. It continues to work its way through the federal court system, but we are told that we have a high likelihood of success. If this rule is allowed to go into place, you all can look forward to ever more interventions in the actual provision of care that you must deal with. We have subsequently filed several lawsuits, in each case identifying a discriminatory practice. For example, we sued Pfizer, the drug company, because they established a very rich employment opportunity, including funding for education, enhanced career growth, and other benefits. But if you were white or Asian, you were not eligible for this program. Pfizer took down this fellowship after we initiated the lawsuit, but the case progresses through the federal courts because of the disputed question of whether our member could remain anonymous yet be the lead plaintiff. The legal story on this is complex, and there are more favorable judgments that have been rendered. But this will be an important ongoing tool for us to attack discriminatory practices. This case may work its way to the Supreme Court for final determination. We have several lawsuits, including several against states that have various medical boards that by law must include minority members. This particular practice is clearly illegal, but even more nefarious is the fact, as Dr. Hughes mentioned as well in her talk, that it undermines the achievement of black physicians and other minority physicians who have gained the respect and admiration of their colleagues and have been appointed to state medical boards because of their reputations and achievements. The law makes it sound like it's their skin color that determines whether they should receive this honor. We have found that even the most prestigious institutions are deeply involved in various DEI activities that are, again, clearly illegal. We have recently sent letters of complaint to the Office of Civil Rights arguing that the Cleveland Clinic, which established a clinic only for black men, is in violation of U.S. anti-discrimination laws. Community outreach efforts by large health systems are clearly needed, but they do not need to be, nor they should be, on a racial basis. Our latest success was in combating a scholarship program created by the American Association of University Women. This scholarship precluded white women from applying. We began a lawsuit, and the association first refused to back down and initiated a legal defense. A week later, they changed their minds and agreed to rescind this proposal. We currently have 11 lawsuits pending against various organizations. We were quite proud when Dana Perino, a former White House press secretary, mentioned on a Fox News show, I quote her, "Watch out if Do No Harm shows up. They win their cases." Another tool we have used has been complaints to the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, for whom plaintiff standing is not a requirement. One simply has to identify a discriminatory practice. We have filed over 140 of such complaints and continue to see success in overturning discriminatory practices such as visiting fellowships only for minority medical students. Those ought to be on the basis of need, of financial need, not on the basis of skin color. This is a slow and laborious route to action, but I think you will see fewer and fewer outright discriminatory initiatives in the coming months. Word has gotten out that we are watching as our members continue to alert us to these un-American activities. Justice Anthony Scalia was famously skeptical about governmental powers, but he did believe that the government should act when there is a clear and compelling justification. We at Do No Harm feel that government intervention to prevent discriminatory practices in healthcare is a justified case of such power. Certainly, it needs to be carefully limited to avoid infringing on personal freedoms. We have taken the approach, particularly at the state level, to persuade the governors to issue executive orders, such as occurred in Oklahoma, or the legislature to pass laws that eliminated DI initiatives in healthcare and medical education. And this has now occurred in 10 states. This has required a focus on states with Republican legislatures and governors to pass such legislation, and we have been successful in over a dozen states to scale back or even eliminate DEI activities in medical schools that are state-supported. We are focused on eliminating offices for DEI and eliminating expenditures on outside consultants that provide DEI training. We have also proposed many states that many states have transparency about the criteria for admission to medical school. Just to give you an idea about this, at Tennessee, the legislature found out that the University of Tennessee Medical School was spending $3 million a year on its DEI office alone, just in the medical school. More recently, Dr. Greg Murphy, the only practicing physician in Congress and a representative from North Carolina, introduced a bill in the House called the Educate Act. My organization worked closely with Dr. Murphy to sponsor this legislation, and he has acknowledged that in several public statements. The legislation, now with over 60 sponsors in the House, demands that any medical school that accepts federal funding of any sort, including research grants, must first eliminate its DEI office, secondly, not spend funds on DEI consultants, and finally, be transparent on the criteria for medical school admission. When these DEI offices go away, you're going to see a dramatic change in these institutions because they really hold the universities and the medical schools administration captive. They're afraid to combat anything that these people come up with, and getting rid of these offices is crucial. While any such legislation has an extremely difficult journey to passage, it illustrates the wide recognition of the problem that the DEI enterprise has produced for American medicine. This will be a long struggle. Progressive elements have taken over many academic institutions in virtually all medical schools. While their original intentions may have been reasonable, the results present the seed of a disastrous turn towards racialism engulfing our entire healthcare system. Kendi claims that the only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination, and the only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination. This is all nonsense. The original Hippocratic Oath spoke of treating all patients, no matter what their social station, equally and with the utmost skill of the physician. We need to rededicate ourselves to this high standard and to guarantee that we will not propagandize to our patients, will not attempt to indoctrinate our patients into any political ideology, but will only see them as God's children who turn to us for comfort and hopefully cure. We must also guarantee to the American people that we will dedicate ourselves to training the most meritorious individuals to have the privilege of caring for patients. Anything less will tarnish the respect and trust that our profession has earned over the centuries and must continue to enjoy in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.